Well, thank you all for joining us here today. This is really exciting for us at IX Investments because it's the very first event that was meant to be an in person event of a brand new company called Family Impact. Family Impact is setting out to be the TED for family offices, if you will, a live events platform and also a digital media platform and education platform for family offices with a specific impact on social impact. Specific focus on social impact. I'm Trevor Nielsen. I'm the co-founder and CEO of IX Investments, and we're joined today with a really incredible group of people for the topic of can we build back better? The role of private capital in the economic recovery. We believe that family offices and the $6 trillion of wealth that they control can play a critically important role in addressing the world's greatest challenges. That's the core premise of IX Investments, and that's the core premise of Family Impact. That includes challenges like climate change, racism, gender equality, social justice issues that all of us are struggling with so mightily today. Today, we're going to hear from several family office leaders, investors, experts, leaders from financial services. And a quick housekeeping note, we will answer some questions after each session. And so if you have a chance, please send your questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. With that, it's my incredible pleasure to introduce Sarah Bloom Raskin. Sarah is the chair of IX Investments. She's a former Deputy Secretary of the United States Department of the Treasury and former Federal Reserve Governor of the Federal Reserve Board. In this session, we're also going to hear from Chuck Klarvit. Chuck is the CEO of the Klarvit Capital Family Office and the former co-head of BlackRock Alternative Advisors, the firm's first fund-to-funds platform. And we'll hear from David Brommelkamp, President and CEO of Elodium Investment Consultants. Sarah, take it away.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody to this extraordinary set of discussions, which we're going to lead off with a really fantastic panel talking to two seasoned investors, as Trevor mentioned. But first, I want to set the stage a little bit for this topic, which, of course, is can we build back better? And again, we're not talking about just building back. We're talking about building back better and what that might mean. And to set the stage for it, we don't need much reminding here, but it was just back in March where the country, the markets, the world really faced an unprecedented downturn. What we saw in the space of days really was a fast and massive downfall in economic performance. This, of course, was brought on by the onset of a pandemic, which no part of the world really was able to escape. But one thing that we learned from this was that really due to a lack of preparedness necessitating that came about because of a public health crisis, we needed to lock down the economies. And all the economies of the world were essentially locked down to a point of time in which most businesses, if not all, were essentially shut down. This brought about massive levels of unemployment, particularly in the United States, as well as significant market dysfunction. What we have seen since those dramatic days in March is a different, sort of differential, depending on what country you're in, a differential response to this downturn. In the United States in particular, there has been a massive injection, both from the fiscal side and the monetary policy side, really of a staggering proportion. Emergency lending authorities have been called upon by the Federal Reserve, and the Congress has appropriated trillions of dollars to deal with the flattened economic disaster scene. So we are now in a stage where the economy is beginning to recover. And you can debate what the shape of that recovery is going to look like. But the point is at some point there will be a recovery. And we here at IX are very interested in building and knowing how you build a recovery that is going to be sustainable, one that's durable, one that doesn't bring us back to the place where we started. So, with that said, we have the opportunity to talk to two really seasoned investors, both David Brommelkamp and Chuck Clarvett. And I'd like to present to them really two questions and then turn it to them to react to these questions. But as seasoned investors, what I would like to hear, and I think what we'd all like to hear from them, is really how they approach these events from an investment perspective. I would love to know really what were the top three things that they each did since March 23rd to from an investment perspective, and I think we could learn quite a bit from them hearing what their approaches were. I'd also like to hear a sense of what obstacles they believe exist to engaging in impact investing at this time. What were those obstacles, and are they obstacles that can be overcome, that should be overcome, that are worth trying to overcome? So with those two sets of questions in mind, I thought we would start with David. And David, again, just to first of all welcome you, thank you for joining us, for being part of our family, and really wanting to hear again your sense of really how you approached the calamitous, dramatic effects since March 23rd. What were the three things that you did? And then what obstacles you are encountering as they pertain to impact investing. So I will stop there and turn to you. And thank you, David, to begin.
Thank you. I'll just rattle off a little bit about what happened here, but starting with the idea that Allodium is an independent firm. We're Minneapolis-based, fee-only firm. We work with individual families, endowments, trusts, nonprofits, etc. And our investment approach is really long-term oriented, and we use asset allocation and rebalance. We're very disciplined. And so when you talk about what did we do in the middle of March, well, stocks went down 30%, bonds didn't go down, so we sold some bonds and bought some stocks, and now the stocks I think went up 40 or 45%, and now we sell some stocks and we buy some bonds. It's very disciplined, very orderly. And we talk about the way we manage portfolios is like a college endowment fund would manage their portfolio. Very thoughtful, very disciplined. The other thing that we do is we layer on this idea of responsible investing. And the idea of responsible investing is interpreted by the individual investor or the organization. They all have a unique value set, and they decide what they care about, and then they develop their investment policies based on what they care about. And so when I ran into IX Investments last year and somebody gave me Howard Buffett's book, and I went like, I go to a lot of conferences where people talk about a lot of great ideas about responsible investing, but then they go back to the office or they go back and they don't really implement anything because they don't know how to implement. And what I saw with IX is I said, you know, what Trevor was talking about, collaboration between business and nonprofits and the government and solving these big world problems, I said, that's finally, I see a practical way of approaching solving some of these practical problems. So that's kind of how I got associated with IX last year. And I would look at it and say, I think that my investment in IX is probably the coolest investment I made last year. So I kind of look back at that and say, I'm kind of glad I stumbled onto IX. But when we went into this global pandemic, the thing that hit me initially is that global virus pandemics are temporary. This has actually happened many times before in our history. The thing that's a new concept is that they shut the economy down. And it really got shut down by, they said like the NBA decided we're not gonna like have any more games. And a lot of businesses shut down the economy. Investors don't like uncertainty, so it made a lot of sense that the stock market decline in March was very rapid and very consistent and dramatic because investors don't like that uncertainty. But disciplined investors, hopefully like college endowment funds, they rebalanced their portfolios during March and participated in the rally over the last 10 weeks, and now maybe did some more rebalancing in the last couple of weeks. We would think that there's a difference between a market recovery and an economic recovery. And the current rally is kind of talking about an expected economic recovery. Personally, I'm very supportive of everything the federal government and the Federal Reserve has done to like put a Band-Aid on this to help us get through this particular crisis. But relative to strategic asset allocation, we haven't really changed anything for our strategic long-term asset allocations. We've been just taking advantage of the volatility to rebalance. And we expect that the economy is in a healing process, probably for the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. And the market probably will reflect that healing process as we go into the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. The three ideas that I would leave you with is like, what are we doing? After we rebalance our portfolios, we kind of look at the future and say like, what's going to happen? The one thing I think is almost a certainty is that the growth of responsible investing over the last 10 to 15 years is going to continue, but these big crises actually accelerate the trend. In our firm, we have a business plan and we identify the major trends that are going to affect the economy in our business. And one of them is that socially responsible investing is a growing trend. It's persistent and it's accelerating. And these big crises in the economy and in the financial world make investors a little bit more introspective in saying, what should we do about this? And layered on top of this coronavirus problem, you've also got this racial diversity or racial issues out there. And we're having conversations with investors that are saying, how can I get my money more in alignment with not being part of the problem? So that's kind of really what's happening. So my three ideas that I'll throw out there, and then if Steve asks me questions later, these are the three areas he can ask me questions about. But the first is, I look at responsible investing, and personally I say, I wonder if I should, like, what's an opportunity? I'm kind of looking right now at organic farmland, organic farms and farmland for organic farmers. And I said, I think the demand for that's going to go up a lot in the next 10 or 20 years. I probably should own some organic farmland. So we're doing some due diligence research on that. Typically, if I decide to do something, I usually end up telling people about it, and the next thing you know, other people are doing the same thing. The second thing is for philanthropic strategies. Last year, the best philanthropic activity I did was I started a donor-advised fund at a foundation called the Venn Foundation. Venn is like the Venn diagram, V-E-N-N. And what this allows me to do is do program-related investments that are very specific. Basically, I'm making a loan inside of my donor-advised fund. I get a couple % interest, and sometimes I get warrants. The investment pays back, and I can recycle those investments. It's one of the neatest philanthropic ideas I've ever seen. And I've already done 5 program-related investments in the past 12 months. And I know that I just did one in the last 30 to 45 days by investing or loaning money to a company that makes masks. If you can imagine, there's a need for masks in the world. I told my wife about it, and she said, yeah, it sounds like a good idea. Let's kind of loan money to a company that needs, the world needs masks, and they're going to manufacture masks. So that was like my philanthropic idea, is the Venn Foundation. And then the oddest one is a lot of our nonprofit clients have a really hard time where the executive director or some of the board members might be real passionate about responsible investing or impact investing. And then the other half of the board is, like I say, the CPA, the attorney, and the accountant, and they say, or the banker or whatever, the actuary, and they say, well, we can't do that impact investing. It'll breach our fiduciary duty. It'll hurt our performance. It'll cost too much. It's too risky. And so these obstacles to impact investing for nonprofit organizations, it's a corporate governance issue, and the solution to it is behavioral governance and almost leadership training. And so what I've embarked on is this, I'm collaborating with some national experts to do some training on how to help nonprofit organizations to overcome the obstacles to impact by using behavioral governance. Well, those look like really three different ideas: responsible investing, philanthropic strategies, and then nonprofit training. But literally, that's what we're doing. My team does all the rebalancing of portfolios, so I don't really have to spend much of my time worrying about that. I'm focusing on things that might help investors get their portfolios more impactful, whether it's their actual investment dollars or their philanthropic dollars. So hopefully I said enough there to kind of give Steve some opportunity to ask me some challenging questions.
Okay, should I go, Sarah?
Sure, that's great. Hello, Chuck. Good to see you.
How you been? Nice to see you. So let me start off by saying, although I was an econometrics major in university, my first job was as an engineer at IBM. And what it basically taught me was that you should always try to optimize, knowing that you will never, ever reach perfection. So I sort of look at, I'm very lucky. I am a first-gen family office. I am a U.S. taxpayer, but I don't want the taxes to drive my investments, but I am always conscious or cognizant of the after-tax effect. And I have a view that anything I invest in, I try to make sure it will leave the world in a better place than where I started. It doesn't always get me there, but I really try to have that as an underlying theme when I invest. I don't call it socially conscious. I don't use ESG. I don't, use all these terms because I just want to make the world better, but I want to make a good return while I'm doing that. Because I'm first gen, about 50% of my assets are very long term. I look at it as a 10-year investment, and I'm trying to do a 2 to 6x multiple on that investment. That drives me to a lot of venture capital type investments primarily. And from a tax standpoint, it's very effective because I'm very early stage and I get to enjoy the qualified small business tax exemption. I do maintain about 15% of my money in ETFs. And that's where I became a little bit more active because Jay Powell made cash trash. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but there's zero return in fixed income. It drove the market up 46% in the month of March, or 44%, excuse me. So I just think it got a little overheated. I don't normally become a trader in my ETFs. I hold them. I've actually owned them for 7 years pretty much. But I finally sold puts to get into the market because I have so much cash, and I actually sold calls against positions that I owned knowing that I could be taken out. So that's my short-term trading. And then thirdly, in the middle of all that is what I would call more the non-correlated opportunity set, things that don't get affected by the stock, bond, or commodities market. And just an example of one of those is I own an interest in 60 ball players and their salaries. It has no correlation to the markets, right? So it's a very interesting asset class. It'll make me good returns. And once again, I can sleep every night not knowing, not caring where the markets are headed. I would just say from your initial question, the things that get me super excited is I look at the S&P 500 and I know that companies are constantly coming in and out of that index over the last 50 years, many of which are now bankrupt. And that you can either look at it from the downside or the positive. I look at it from the positive side and the fact that disruption that continues to take place in energy, in space, in cybersecurity, in healthcare, in education, and in food, and I could go on and on, material sciences, will definitely leave this world in a much better place if I continue to fund it for my children and my grandchildren. So I am super excited from that. And I try not to let this unfortunate world of what we're experiencing right now completely dominate my view for the next 10 years. Certainly you should take advantage of the trades that are there, but I don't lose focus that my 50% will dominate and outproduce the other portfolio opportunity set. So I'll just stop.
Those are terrific, terrific presentations. And I think what we want to do is we've been getting a number of questions coming in. And what I would do is, Steve, ask you to call on people or read the questions as you have received them and present them really to David or Chuck or both, or me, if anything is, of interest in that dimension. So Steve, turning to you to start going through some of these questions.
Sure. This is to everybody, but I think it came in during David's discussion. Alan Reed asks, what guidelines do you use for proxy voting? Do they differ by client? And do any of you have a take on, as people concerned with the impact of your investments, how do you approach proxy voting?
I think that shareholder advocacy is a big opportunity for people that want to have more impact with their investments. And we've had some really good successes over the years where we can identify letters going to a publicly traded company from one of our clients that resulted in a change on the board of directors. I can think of one for sure as gender diversity. All male board of directors, I can't remember if the number was 5 or 7 board of directors. The company received the letter from our client and decided to add 2 women to the board based on that letter. And that's really have an impact with your invested dollars. And all of our clients that own individual securities have that ability, even if it's owned in a professionally managed account, or we even use some separately managed accounts that basically are index funds, but you can still do the shareholder advocacy work in those kinds of investment vehicles.
Thank you. I'm going to ask, because we've got so many questions in such limited time, let's really frame the responses so we can get to a number of these great questions. Chuck or Sarah, anything on that?
I would just argue, just like voting for a politician, everybody should be voting their shares on every issue in a proxy. It is very important. Don't think your voice doesn't matter.
Thank you. So, Sarah, any comments, or can I move on to?
Yeah, I would move on.
Thank you. So Robin Rowe asks, there's the massive debt of COVID-19 bailouts. They primarily have gone to large companies, but also to small businesses. How concerned are we that the trillions of dollars out into the system, the Dow has benefited temporarily from it, and there's all kinds of political ramifications running up to the elections. But what happens to the markets as the payback period comes? Do you see that disruptive moment when that liquidity has to be paid back or there's an effect from it?
Let me jump in on Robin's question. Robin, thank you for that. Really a perceptive question, and I commend you for thinking long term here, because there is going to be consequence to all of these extraordinary policy actions that have been taken. So you point us to the debt, the significant debt that has been incurred primarily by Congress in the midst of this, in the midst of dealing with the pandemic. And I guess what I would say in terms of that debt is that it is going to be of concern later on. In the short term, and if you listen to Jay Powell and the Fed on this, I think you would hear this idea resonate, which is that there may need to be still significant stimulus to move us through and support a recovery that is going to be a sustainable one. Now, let me just add something that I don't think that they necessarily add, these policymakers don't necessarily add, but it has to be the right kind of spending, the right kind of debt. I mean, one of the attributes of fiscal policy is that it is supposed to be a targeted kind of spending. It's supposed to target assistance to where it is most needed. And as you point out in your question, or as Steve kind of reformulates your question, there's a concern as to whether this assistance is landing in the places where it is most needed. And you saw in the days, for example, of the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP program, that there were many firms taking advantage of these funds with quite a bit of political blowback, because they were potentially not the kind of firms that were intended to be able to access this kind of assistance. So there was a sense that there was a mismatch between where the assistance was going and who was getting it. So your question about debt, I think, really comes down to this idea of the right kind of debt, the right kind of spending, and if Congress can do that, I think that will have the potential to really help sustain this recovery going forward. That is on the fiscal side. Now, the monetary side has a different kind of spending, which we can sort of, talk about in another context. But I think your question is a good one, and I think you're right to be reminding everybody that there are consequences and that there will be, in essence, some costs and some real issues to grapple with when the pandemic is over.
Abby or Gina, can you give me a time check right now on this so we can formulate the right number of questions?
Sure, we have a few more minutes for about one or two more questions, Steve.
Great, thank you. Looney Leaves asks something similar to what David talked about. How do we get foundations and donor advised funds to do more impact investing? All right, the key is what all of us have, some of us have spheres of influence. How do we get past lawyers and other gatekeepers from pushing back on this? And is there something practical that you would recommend?
Well, I would say it's not only just nonprofits and foundations and endowments, but it's also families where you have 3 generations of the family And usually the younger ones are the ones that have the passion for impact investing. And I think it's all about documenting mission, vision, and values, and trying to say, how do we, or do we want to align our investments with our core values? And in order for you to have a productive discussion, you have to start with the idea that you do have shared values and you do have a defined mission and a vision for where you're going. That's why when I'm developing a training for nonprofits, I'm bringing in a governance expert who understands behavioral governance in the same way that some people need behavioral finance training to be better investors. I think that the nonprofit boards need behavioral governance training in order for them to be able to make better decisions. And I've been doing this for 30 years, and I'm getting sick and tired of people saying that they have a problem. So I've decided I'm gonna identify the problems and then help them solve the problems. And what will come out of it is people get really happy when they make investments that are in alignment with their mission, vision, and values. They really do appreciate it. Not easy work, but they really do appreciate it at the end. So I think it comes down to training.
Thank you, David. Chuck, how do you balance this in your nonprofit work?
Well, so I serve on a number of boards for endowments and foundations. You know, I think the proper presentation starts with that the investment holds up on its own versus any other investment in the asset allocation. It has the return, it has the risk, it has the correlation, it has the liquidity that is this equivalent, if not better than any other investment I might look at. And then it's got that added benefit that it makes the world a better place. So it becomes an extremely compelling case study or story for any CIO, regardless. And I think there's so many investments I've underwritten that I would say meet all those criteria and then some.
Thanks, Chuck. We're getting some amazing questions. Some of them, I hope people get a chance to see some of the comments too, that are not specifically framed as questions, but really trying to challenge us to look at things in different manners. You know, I've gotten a question from someone named Hochstrasser, and a couple different ones. Let's start with the appetite for family offices for tax equity investments in community scale renewable energy projects. And the framing is there are specific projects that are dedicated to, you know, having renewable energy targeted to local communities, not projects that are, you know, multi-state or huge, but do you see that as an investment that you're focused on? Do you see good deal flow there?
That one for Dave or Chuck?
Either one, just throw in here.
Well, what I'm trying to do is find ways to remove carbon. I'm trying to find new ways to use the sun to produce energy. You know, I'm trying to find exciting new techniques. I probably have not focused on the questionnaires' specific goals as much, personally. David?
Yeah, I think that the issue that I usually run into is that people have something that they want to do today, and I say that pretty much anything is possible, but you got to do a lot of due diligence research, and then you got to make choices, like trade-off choices, you know, liquidity versus risk or return, or I mean, there's all these different variables that you have to balance. And a lot of times when people look at it and say, well, I'm not that passionate about that, to be going into an illiquid investment that might give me half the return of the S&P 500 or something. So it comes down to, do you have a holistic approach to this? On my team, I told my chief investment officer I wanted to invest in some organic farmland. And he kind of says, his first response was, Dave, but isn't that illiquid? You know, and I go, okay, he's my obstacle to impact. I've got the great idea. He's the one that's kind of throwing a bucket of cold water on me. But in the end, if I want it bad enough, I'm going to get it, even though he explains to me what all the detractions are for that. So when people get honed in on an idea that they want to do, I would always say it's possible, but then you also have to put it in the context of all of the other things that you could potentially do, you know, with your investable dollars.
Thank you, David. We have time for a couple more questions if we motor through them. One is from Liz Fedorowicz, if I pronounced that right. Talk about how you focus on initiatives to hire minority employees and minority-led companies. Give us a practical way to focus on that and you know, implement that impact strategy. Chuck?
Oh, you want me to go first? Well, first of all, I would say regardless of the color of your skin, your race, your religion, your anything, I don't even look at that. In fact, I don't look at prior track records either when I start my analysis. I look at a business plan, I look at the materials, and I evaluate, is this something that's sound and fundamentally something I should do more work on? So I purposely don't look at people or who's bringing it to me in advance. And I purposely don't look at the track record so it influences me one way or the other from the very start, because I want to look at the process, the philosophy, you know, where is this thing potentially going for the future versus what has it done in the past? And then I'm going to consider the people and their track record of where they've been, their bios, their backgrounds. You know, I don't know if this is by chance or whatever, but more than a third of my venture companies are women-based. And they've done phenomenally well. And it wasn't like I went out saying I need to do women-based startups. It's just that these people have started some amazing companies, and I think they're going to be extraordinarily successful. To be very honest, I don't go out and say I got to have minority people in my portfolio or not. As they present their ideas, I am totally open to, you know, funding them if I think they're going to be a great business.
That's helpful, Chuck. David, do you have any special focus on that? And Sarah, I'm going to ask you to wrap this up in a comment about that in a moment.
Okay. What I would say is at a high level, last year there was really big demand for fossil fuel-free portfolios. I mean, it was like really intense for us in the last 12 months. And we've helped a lot of people with fossil fuel-free portfolios. My prediction is the new demand is going to be for racial diversity and diversity and inclusion in general. And so some of the ideas we've been recommending to people are, you know, you can look for investment managers that are minority owned. You can look for private equity and VC companies and that are minority owned. If you're going to own publicly traded companies, you can look at the racial diversity on the board of directors. Other people might have gender diversity as an issue. It's the same thing. I look at it as an employer, and we wanted to hire a new senior consultant, and we had two really good candidates, and one man, one woman. And, you know, we had a big discussion about, you know, which candidate to hire. And the idea of gender diversity became very important as part of that. At the end of the day, I didn't have to make a hard decision because we decided to hire both candidates. I kind of like did the escape hatch on that one. We got two really good candidates, but for us, it's hard for us if we post a job and we get 50 job applicants and there's like one minority out of the 50. It's like, what is wrong with the investment business that we just don't get the applications in our business that, so we don't reflect the diversity of society as an investment firm. It's really hard for us to, you know, work at that, but that's at the employer level. But you also have to look at, you know, publicly traded companies. They have a board of directors, they have senior management, they have CEOs. you come up with your metric and you decide what's important to you. And to me, that's what investing is all about, is you have to be able to measure your impact, and you get to decide what you want the impact to be. And there's lots of different metrics you can choose. So to me, that is trying to get the investor to clarify what they want for impact, and then going out into the marketplace and making those appropriate decisions to get the impact that they're looking for.
Thank you, David. We've had so many great questions. Emerging markets. You know, a lot of questions were focused on IX specifically in this and what we do. We'd be glad to answer those questions individually later. In closing, I'm going to paraphrase the last question from Mark Preston, the CEO of Grosvenor Estate. He's talking about how might sustained monetary financing as a policy option be followed in the US, UK, EU, and how will it affect the world of impact investing. And what this really comes down to, Sarah, is we need a commentary of what policy can do that we can follow that takes our tax dollars and uses it in a manner that aligns with the change we want to see in this world.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question, Steve. Thank you for participating and queuing up these extraordinary questions from our audience. I want to say thank you to David and Chuck. I could talk to the both of you for much longer. You have such terrific insights. And, you know, this time has been, you know, this period, this last couple months has really just been extraordinary from, you know, from the perspective of understanding collectively how we are in our society going to be tackling some of the world's greatest challenges. I mean, to David's point, you know, in some respects, the crisis has accelerated the trend of thinking about impact in a way that many people may not have thought about it before. I mean, you know, just at the point in time, you know, we get hit by a pandemic. You have, in essence, a major risk that has come to us and exposed really the world's vulnerabilities in a way that we had never seen before, and it flattens the economy to a complete standstill. We see, in essence, the mounting numbers of deaths, the grief, the astonishing losses that we have confronted, and then right at that moment, we have, in essence, a reopening of an understanding of the systemic and institutional racism that has permeated our society. And to a lot of the people's questions, I want to say, thank you for recognizing the fact that there are huge challenges ahead. And I would like to think that that we have in the world of impact investing, and with the likes of expertise like David's and Chuck's, and I know many of you, the opportunity really to figure out how we are going to imagine an economic resurgence, an economic rebuilding, an economic reconstruction almost, that is going to take into account not just building an economy that looked like it did going into this crisis, but one that is going to be more durable, more inclusive, less subject to outside shocks, one that is more collective, one that essentially captures a lot of the things that we talk about when we talk about impact. So I want to thank both David and Chuck for sharing their deep and very nuanced wisdom and perspectives on this topic. I want to thank the audience and the people who are listening in for your excellent questions. This is a conversation that is going to need to be repeated in different formats. One that I think is going to need much more exploration than we've begun here. I urge everybody to be thinking more boldly, to be thinking about what our economy is really capable of doing, and how we create with our policy choices as well as our investment choices a world that is one that we want to live in. So thank you all, and looking forward to the rest of this extraordinary seminar today.
Thank you, Sarah. Chuck and David, we appreciate you participating. Let me now introduce my friend Patricia Saputo, the CFO of Placements Italcan Inc. from Montreal. Patricia will lead the next session, Alignment of Interest, Governance, and Long-Term Impact. We'll hear from panelists like Dr. Ashby Monk, Executive and Research Director of the Stanford Global Project Center at Stanford University, Louise de Ségur de Charbonnet, Executive Chairman of the Time Family Office and of Ensada Family Office, and James Wilcox, Floria Multifamily Office, where he's a managing partner and participates in the key governance structures of the families and works with shareholders on how they should work with all stakeholders. Patricia, if you'll begin this session, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Thank you for the introduction and for introducing the panel. So this panel is on the alignment of interest, governance, and long-term impact. It is an international panel, as we do have James Wilcox, who's in the UK, Ashby Monk is in the United States, Louis is in Brazil, and I myself am in Canada. James will be providing us a perspective on the charitable world, the charities. Ashby will have more the perspective on pensions and institutions, and Louis will be more on the family perspective in looking at this topic. So if I can start with James, and like our panel, the audience is also an international audience, so I will start with maybe asking James to provide us with an overview of the UK charity sector functions.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you everyone today from a rainy London on Grosvenor Street. So what I'd like to explain is that the UK charity world and charity regulations, although they go back as early as 593, I think, when there was a school, are more recently regulated, sort of onwards from 2000 with very strict legislation. And what you have is a regulator. So why is this interesting and relevant? Well, it's if you're a family and running a business, running a charity is equally as important, because you're facing a regulator with 350 staff, with a wide range of powers and an ability to scrutinize your activities. So you need to ensure you've got a board of trustees and you're following very prescribed guidelines when you create the charity. Interestingly, they investigate about 150 charities each year. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that it really forms part of the framework when you look at finance in London. Charity normally sits alongside it, just as it does in New York and elsewhere. And due to the COVID crisis, UK government has injected £750 million towards small and medium charities during this period, along with other measures that they've taken due to the COVID crisis.
So how has the highly regulated sector, like what has it done for the donors in the UK?
So most donors, we train. So when the families that we deal with decide to create a foundation or a charity, we run a series of courses to train them how to be a trustee, because it's being like a board director. And also what we do is encourage them to understand a process which includes grant applications and donor agreements. So when we get involved with a charity, so a friend asks them, or we look at them as a board, we ask them to make a grant application, so we study the financials, and then usually on the donor agreements, we make a commitment for 1 to 3 years. So what I'm trying to say is we create a legal and a contractual framework. This is really another part of your business. And as I say, in the UK, it's highly regulated and needs to be watched very carefully.
So what are the difficulties that one would encounter then?
Well, it comes back to this idea of a trustee board, and following the rules. So some of the founders, patriarchs, want to create their mission and life and legacy, find it quite difficult that they need to come back to some of the points raised earlier. There's diversity, a board of directors, and importantly, the other thing that has been a feature here recently is your reputation. If you get this wrong, the family spent a lifetime building a reputation, but you can lose it very quickly if you suddenly get a charity commission investigating and saying you need to pay back the money on this particular donation or charity.
That was the same thing that David brought up earlier about that reputational risk and the charitable events that you might be involved with. And so in your case, what have you done for your clients?
So to give sort of case studies and working examples, over the last 3 years, we've established 3 foundations. We normally work with a law firm because it's quite a complex process. It takes 6 to 12 months. And each charity is designed to form part of a family's enduring legacy. And it's really what they want to leave when they're gone. Most of our clients create what we call an endowment. So they leave money or property towards the charity. And when I say money, usually a lump sum. Property, more recently, we've had clients donating large London buildings to specific charities as a way of giving back to, say, a healthcare charity or other charity. So these lump sums, whether they're money or property, endow the charity and give them a purpose and then an annual interest from which they can make grants.
And can you give us an example of maybe one of the specific charities that you have that helps set up?
Yeah, of course. So one of our families followed this practice, and let's say, for example, it's a 10 million endowment. They said out of that, we want to earn 4 to 5% interest, and that interest will go towards underprivileged children in London. And they selected something I think that's relevant to all of us and what we're facing today. They decided they needed to support modern youth clubs. So there is a group called the Legacy Youth Network in the United Kingdom, where what they've done is taken a 100-and-something-year-old idea and modernized it. So they work with local authorities. So this case, the one in Croydon, that the local authority gave the land, and then they built what's like a small school or a small campus with sports facilities, well-being center, focus on food, how to nurture yourself. And so what they've done is taken the children off the school. After 4:30 at night, they can go to this very well-equipped center and be safe. What's interesting when you go there is unfortunately the security. So there are rather large people on the door there to collect knives and any weapons that anyone may want or think about taking in.
And what would be appealing to you from an alignment of interest and governance perspective?
Well, I work in the finance industry. I'm a lawyer by background. What surprised me was the imagination of the local authority. So here you have London local authorities deciding to give away land towards a new youth centre, but do it as a public-private initiative. So the council give you the land, and then the charity, the Legacy Youth Network, raise the money for each building, which is roughly they add on. So the land is usually £5 to £7 million for each site. Land in London, it's usually sort of unused areas that the council is not using. And then they raise a similar amount to match it, to fund it, and again endow it. So for me, I thought this is a really interesting idea and creative, but also gives, in today's society where we all have this problem of gang and drug culture, you've got new modern centres as an alternative and a safe place to go.
And how do you see them managing the whole process?
So as a board of any of these charities, what we do is in the grant application process, we do financial due diligence, business plans, a review of what the charity is. Again, it comes back to reputation. Are you giving money to a group of people? Just like any investment, is this a group of people you trust? Is it the people that will use the money in the way that you want them to use that money? And then within the donor agreement, again, normally 1 to 3 years, we have very specific clauses. So if charities do something that we really disagree with, and this has happened in the UK, Kids Company, unfortunately, was a sad example, where there's a misuse of public and private funds, then you have the ability to stop the donations and say, actually, I don't agree with this, so legally, I'm withdrawing from this process.
And finally, with the coronavirus, has the charity been impacted? And if so, what did it do to help the youth in the situation?
Good question. So the youth center was locked down. So what they've done is they've created Zoom calls, just like this one. They have a team that delivers food and medicine to households along with food packages. And then finally, if I can just add what we've done as Floriat, we've been supporting the NHS. So we've given money to Richard Caring's kitchens at Annabelle's. Some of you may know Annabelle's. Richard Caring turned Annabelle's into a massive NHS kitchen where he serves 7,500 meals a week to the NHS workers. Similarly at the Berkeley Hotel, for those of you who've stayed there, the Berkeley Hotel is now a refreshment point. If you're an ambulance driver or a fire engine or a police officer, you can stop outside the Berkeley Hotel and you will be fed. So I think what I'm trying to say is there's some very interesting community projects that have emerged. People are kinder, more compassionate. So there are some positive aspects to this.
Thank you very much, James. As we will now turn over to Ashby Monk. And if I can then get your perspective on what you consider the alignment of interest, governance, and long-term impact as an institutional investor, what would your point of view be?
Yeah, thanks so much, Patricia and Steve and everybody for giving me the chance to come on and talk about what some people think are pretty big, boring organizations, pension plans, sovereign funds. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll just see how sexy and exciting these organizations really are. That's my focus, right? So the whole focus of my work, funnily, kind of is how do we align the interests of these big organizations to drive more impact, often through changes in governance. So you've written a title for a session that I could probably talk for 4 hours on, but I'll try to explain my perspective in 2 minutes and then we can have questions. So pension funds, sovereign funds, endowments, foundations, insurance companies, and family offices all fit into this kind of category for us that we call beneficial long-term investors. They're incredibly important and understudied. Their importance is kind of twofold. One, they often form foundations of the modern welfare state. So if you're, expecting retirement security in any way, shape, or form, you're probably getting it out of one of these entities. If we're funding healthcare research or we're supporting students at universities or whatever it is, we're often drawing some form of capital out of these organizations. They have a DNA that has a social mission. At the same time that they have that social mission and they're incredibly important to all of the social and impactful things that I think we on this webinar probably care about, they also serve as the base of capitalism. So the OECD would tell you they have about $100 trillion in assets under management. And so they're strange and they straddle the two worlds of, social benefits and social welfare and government in many cases through the most competitive ecosystems in the world in financial markets. Private equity, hedge funds, venture capital, so on and so forth, they get their capital out of these beneficial organizations that usually enjoy tax advantage status, which sort of gives you a sense of what they're doing. The allocators of the world are usually tax advantaged, not in the family office space, but in most of the others. And so they're important, they're understudied, and that's why we study them. But they also represent an incredible opportunity because of their time horizon and their scale. The time horizon means that they should care about things like climate change, wealth inequality. I don't know if people saw this last week, but the final recipient of a Civil War pension plan passed away. So these pension organizations touch across centuries, not just decades. And so when you're designing an investment policy for long-term issues, pensions are wonderful places to start because, if you're going to go out 100 years, you're going to start to say, well, all these social and environmental risks that we've been told to ignore because of the fiduciary duties that are kind of placed on us, actually, long enough time horizon, all that just becomes financial. If climate change is real and I have a 50-year time horizon, I'm worried about my Florida real estate. I'm excited about my Wyoming real estate. I'm worried about my Napa real estate. These are all things that long-term investors are going to care about. And so we see in them huge pools of capital to drive impact. The 100 trillion, if we just tilt them a little bit, who knows? We can unlock $1 trillion for solutions to climate change. And the social DNA should make that possible. That's the good part, is they represent this incredible opportunity to help fix capitalism, extend the time horizon, et cetera. The bad part is that they're largely dysfunctional. So because they straddle the worlds of government and capital markets, or universities with all the politics that I know all too well exists there, and capital markets, we end up in decision-making contexts that are non-obvious. It's very hard to unravel why decisions are being made the way they are. More than that, they are often designed not to innovate. We push them to be efficient, not innovative. We give police over the asset, which further reduces their incentive to do anything innovative and creative. We tell them they're bound by prudent person rules and fiduciary duties. And so what you end up with is a base of our capitalist system that is already constrained because it sits inside a bureaucratic environment, often government itself. And then we say to them, don't innovate. And they outsource all the innovation to the intermediaries, who, by the way, have a very short time horizon, not 150 years, try 1.5 years. And so all of the financial innovations ends up being short term. And we wonder why we don't get a ton of innovation around climate change or wealth inequality or diversity, because that's the challenge. And so the work that I do, Patricia, has always been around, how do we bring change into these organizations that have been designed not to change? And there's really only 3 levers that we can pull to change these organizations based on the research we've done. We can change their governance, we can change their culture, or we can change their technology. Governance means new resources, new delegation frameworks, new hiring policies. Imagine we paid people working at pension plans like we pay football coaches. They're all state employees, but football coaches will make $3 million a year, and the CIO of a pension plan in Iowa will make 90 grand. Okay, so we don't quite have our priorities straight. So if we can get our governance changed, we can fix that. Culture, we really use culture already in these organizations to recruit good people who want to have an impact, who want to give back, so on and so forth. They're from Stanford, so they want to go back and work at Stanford Endowment. We use that constantly. The culture is kind of how we recruit and retain in this industry. And then the third one is technology. The beauty of technology is it comes across as inevitable. We've got driverless cars, we've got drones, we've got 2 people in a space station, thanks to private industry. Technology feels inevitable. And so of the 3 levers, technology is the one that we have focused the most on to transform the pension, sovereign fund, endowment industry. Governance, I've left my imprint on more brick walls than I care to talk about, just doesn't budge. You really need to come at the governance issue with a major crisis in order to get them to change absolutely anything. And so culture also takes too long. You can destroy culture in a week, but it takes years and years to build it into something really transformative and new. And so over the last 5 years, we have been focused on tech. Just finished a book, came out 2 months ago, called The Technologized Investor. There's your plug. But really the punchline is, most of these organizations are planning for the future. And if you think about, hey, what are the impacts we could have? That's a projection. You know, we want to make sure our portfolio never crosses a level of carbon intensity. That's a projection. It's like liquidity. We can't ever drop below this amount of liquidity. We want to track our pacing into the future and make sure we make no commitments that puts our pacing in jeopardy. Unfortunately, all of those types of projections today, projections into the future, managing the day-to-day process of making commitments, those are done in spreadsheets. Today, this is 50-year-old technology. Find me a toolkit that goes beyond the high-level asset allocation and instead moves you into the day-to-day implementation of your portfolios, and it will be done in a spreadsheet. And so as an academic and as an entrepreneur, we've been working to bring data and analytics inside these organizations to transform the way they think about the future, help them understand the risks that are being created by their portfolios, and ideally, you know, the old saying, you manage what you measure, by demonstrating what these investment decisions are driving into the future, not just from their portfolio perspective, liquidity, cash flow, unfunded commitments, pacing, but also wealth inequality, carbon intensity, et cetera, then we think we can really drive huge impact. And more than that, as we reveal through the data and tech, the hope is we will create crises. Don't tell anybody. But if we can create a few crises by showing, hey, you're sure paying a lot of fees to some dudes in Wall Street, or this portfolio seems pretty tilted towards carbon intense assets, that can become a crisis for the people sitting on the boards of those organizations. And then we can change the governance. But starting with the governance seems like it's too hard to me. So I'll pause there. Sorry if I took more than 2 minutes.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating what you have to say. So in the case of the pandemic today, I mean, has that either changed your way of thinking or has it made you pivot at all?
No, I mean, it reinforces the need to build what we call resilient portfolios. So the kind of ESG world, what Gene Rogers, who started SASB, calls the ESG industrial complex, is in the business of just building more data sets and selling you more data. What we need to do is define what it is to have and hold a resilient set of assets that can manage through pandemics, murder hornets, or any other, you know, thing that's looming on the horizon. And so that's kind of the first thing that I'm hearing is, what does resilience mean? And can we define, just like we define materiality on the side of the companies and the assets that we're investing in, and that was really what SASB was about. We're now getting a lot of searching for, what is materiality on the investor side? What is it that's important to me as an investor that allows me to believe my portfolio is resilient? And then the last thing I'm hearing is we need means to what we call the last mile problem of ESG. So a lot of people are sending tons of different data sets to you. They're saying, look, you've got tons of climate hazard in this portfolio. But most of us look at that and say, what does it mean to have a red asset or a green asset? Is that good? Like, should I load up on that? And so what we need to solve that last mile problem is translation from the hazard, the climate risk, or whatever thing you're looking at, into some financial metric. And in the case of climate change, we can do it. We can look at a building and say, your future cost of insurance here is going to go up at this rate because of climate change. And so we need more research and development in those areas.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Fascinating. So we'll move on to Luis. We'll start. I mean, interesting because we come from the same background in terms of our family, and in the family setting, it's very unique and very different than when you get into a corporate or a institutional setting. If you can provide us maybe with a little bit of background on what your family's governance policies is, like what does it look like in the decision-making process?
Hello, Patricia, and everyone. Thank you for your question. In my family, the governance is one of the most important things. Since the family is in the insurance business for almost 125 years in Brazil, so the long-term view, long-term plan, communication, and everything is really important. I'm a member of the sixth generation, so you can imagine how tough it is to pass to each generation all the challenges and everything that must be done. So to have a clear understanding of what we're looking for the long term, a strong shareholders agreement, and more than this, to be close to each other, this is an important thing, Patricia. So as we already discussed, the governance is really important in order to understand the family needs, the family concerns, and to be everyone in the same path, looking in the same direction.
But in terms of what's been going on with this pandemic, have you found that maybe the governance has to change, or have you proven it to work really well and that there might not be any changes to make?
Excellent question. I think this is what the typical situation that we can put in practice, the relevance of the proper governance of in the family. So in this pandemic, obviously everyone was cautious, concerned, worried about a lot of things. But since we have in place family meetings, emails, a proper communication, and a proper understanding, everyone is fine and in the good sense, comfortable in this situation.
And are there any lessons that you have learned during this time that you can maybe share with us?
Absolutely. I think this is also a classic situation that is possible to be closer to each other sometimes. We're always sometimes in an office, in a plane, behind a table, and less together, physically speaking, sharing simple moments in a family time. Could be in a beach, could be around a good nice of meat, in a simple way, without only talking about business or family assets and everything. So just to come back to the simple things and the origin of the family values also. I think this is a nice moment to simplify everything. I think this is also a nice message. So let's remember that where do we came from, and when we started everything, there was nothing. So let's keep it simple. Let's come back to the simple feelings, emotions, and family sensations that sometimes James and I, we talk a lot about that. We're always busy in so many things, in so many demands and people calling and dinners and blah, blah. But where are the simple things in the family things? And this is the most important thing at the end is family. It's family values.
And can you maybe describe to us any of the pain points that you've lived through that can help us on this side for the audience?
Of course, Patricia, at the beginning, my pain, if I can call this, was to be sure that every single family member was well. So for a few weeks, I was contacting everyone, and this is a family. Is the funny part, because everyone have family members in, I think it's 7 or 8 countries in the world. So to be sure that everyone was settled, properly safe. If there's any doctor or medical issue, who will be eventually available to. So I spent a few weeks in order to be sure that everyone around me, and believe me, there's a few, everyone was well. And more than that, obviously, I needed also myself in a safe place. I live in London. I had to come back to Brazil. This is where we came from somehow. And I wanted to have also my wife, my kids, everyone, emotionally speaking, well, because also we came, if you allow me to say, in the emotional part. All the rational, you think everything, but the emotions sometimes we hide, we keep in a little box. So it's a moment that everyone put the emotions out. And in my role, I have to give a proper comfort to everyone.
So how do you align the interests and opinions across generation and countries?
We have family forums, so we can have a lot of debates and talk about a lot of things. So the family is really open to listen to all the opinions and everything. But then, of course, you start to select what makes sense or not. And as someone just mentioned a few minutes ago, the new generation are pushing the decision makers, if we can call it this, to invest in impact investments. So we have to balance the old way to see things with the new demands. And of course, since the family has a long-term view, the elders respect the young generation, bringing their ideas, bringing their thoughts, and bringing also their desires, for example, in impact investments. So in my case, this is how I had the chance, thanks to James again, and to meet Trevor and everyone in IX, to be closer to this new world of impact investments. I have also kind friends that I hope are here listening to us, is we have this impact investment side and create portfolios and hope somehow able to have a full portfolio of only impact things, not oil things and of non-correct things.
So can you explain what you think the responsibilities and role of the family and the private capital play in global challenges?
We have a huge responsibility because since we have the privilege of so many things, we have to somehow give back. But not only give back, making a check and give it to some we have to be involved, to be engaged. So we have to bring our knowledge that we apply in business, in our insurance company or whatever we do, to the local communities, to charities, to philanthropy, and a lot of things. That's how I try to be as much as possible involved in quite a few charities around the world, and also be aware that we're responsible, that having whatever we have brings responsibility, brings of community, and brings also the duty to move ourselves. The private capital has a lot of duty in this pandemic time. We must be united to everything that, for all the reasons we know, governments they can't do, will not do, or whatever they will not do. As private capital, we must act together.
So what shifts do you see occurring?
Sorry?
What shifts do you see occurring, like in this future, because of the pandemic, because of what we're going through?
I see people acting more together. I can, for example, let's take in the Brazilian perspective. I see more friends and people that I deal with giving more donations to a lot of these local institutions, for example, to build hospitals that somehow they never did anything. So this kind of pandemic has brought the conscious, who are more aware that they must invest in privilege people.
I'm conscientious of time here. Abby or Steve, can you just let me know how we're going? Because I can keep on asking the questions.
Yes,
how are we doing in time?
Patricia, I'm going to turn it over to Trevor in a moment. We've been capturing all these questions and comments from people, and we'll be disseminating them because they're quite fascinating and insightful. But at this time, we may have some time for some Q&A at the end. But Trevor, why don't you take it from here, and then we can move the agenda forward. Thank you so much, Patricia.
Thank you, Steve and Patricia and James and Louis. You know, it's just, and Ashby, for your really insightful remarks. It's really wonderful to have all of you here, and I think the conversation has been really informative, and to me it's shown that we need to continue this in the future. I have the real privilege to introduce Alan Schwartz, who is the executive chairman of Guggenheim Partners. Many of you knew him in his previous life as CEO of Bear Stearns. Alan's a bit of a mentor to me, somebody that I've turned to for questions about how to deal with all sorts of things, and is somebody that spent a lot of time thinking and writing about income inequality. And it strikes me that we can't really talk about the modern crises that we face without talking about income inequality. If families put their head in the sand on that issue, we're bound to see additional problems of the sort that we've seen so far. Just about a week ago, there were buildings on fire and cars on fire about a block from where I'm sitting today here in Santa Monica. And I don't think you can separate issues of police brutality from issues of income inequality. So with that, Alan, I'm going to ask you to speak in kind of a big picture way about what's happening and perhaps what needs to be done.
Okay, well, thank you, Trevor. And as you know, I'm a recovering research director and economist. And so I thought it might be helpful if I just took everybody through my view of a little bit of the history of how we got to where we are today and why the forces that have been talked about today so eloquently by the panelists are really, really powerful. So let me take you back and just say very briefly, when post-World War II productivity wave that we had seen started to peter out, we experienced sustained peacetime inflation for the first time in US financial history. And that was just as the baby boom generation was actually coming into the workforce in a major way. What this led to was a major change in the capitalist model based on a change in governments like Reagan and Thatcher that came in with a new model that was based on government budget restraint, deregulation, pushback on unions, lower taxes on income and capital gains, while at the same time continuing to outspend the Soviet Union on defense. These forces led to strong economic and capital market returns and actually did help bring about the collapse of communism, which was a major result for free market capitalism. But it also brought billions of low-wage earners backed by global capital into the global economy and led to major changes in the US and the Western developed world economies. One of the main things that Trevor just mentioned is that while capital and high income earners could participate in increased global growth, at the same time, pressure from low wage earners around the world came through the middle of these economies and put a lot of pressure downward on middle and lower income workers, leading to the potential ironic outcome that it may have taken the collapse of communism to bring about the unequal outcomes in capitalism that the Marxists had claimed would be what doomed capitalism. And so other things that change that people aren't as aware of is the nature of business cycles changed dramatically. As a point, we experienced in the US 10 recessions in the first 41 or 2 years of the post-World War II recovery. And the current downturn that we're experiencing is the third downturn in 30 years. 2 of those downturns triggered by non-financial events, 9/11 and now the pandemic. And as economic recoveries lasted on average for 10 years, the focus on risk management that existed when the business cycles would go up and down began to wane, while at the same time, globalization was creating a whole new series of major risks that were clearly emerging, but that were being ignored. Things like potential armed conflict, pandemics, social unrest, and the biggest of all, climate change. Now, the leaders of business and government that came into power as this model was shifting and the things we're dealing with, sort of were dealing with the innovator's dilemma. It's generally the ones that have profited the most from the way things were in the past that are the least likely to say, we need to adapt to change to face the new circumstances that we're dealing with. And now, as some of the risks that were clearly coming have now hit us, and it is so clear how completely unprepared to deal with those risks that the leaders of, quite frankly, my generation that have been in power were so unprepared that it is causing some powerful, has been, and now will trigger even more, some major and powerful changes. A new generation of investors, many of which you just heard from today, is being formed and has been formed and is using their capital to drive systemic change. And this new capital is coinciding with new technologies that are emerging that can produce societal benefits as parts of profitable businesses. And companies that do not adapt and follow the investor demands run the risks of being left behind, i.e., it is no longer what came in the 80s, the notion that it was businesses' responsibility to generate profit and government's responsibility to take care of other issues. Now investors are demanding that businesses have to be responsive to the needs of society, and they have the tools to make that happen with new technologies. And as an estimated, I believe it's $65 trillion or so is projected over the next decade to be transferred from one generation to the next. I truly believe that family offices are going to be a major factor and play a major role in this new wave of what I like to refer to as profit with a purpose. And that is why, by the way, a couple of years ago, started a new group at Guggenheim to focus on societal good investments, but with a real focus on climate and environment, because I saw so many technologies coming along. And it's also why, quite frankly, I've gotten close to the IX team, why I'm so supportive of Howard and Trevor and their mission. And I think the last piece I'll say is, while business is going to play, I believe, through the investment community, a more significant role in addressing the societal issues that now are staring people in the face and they can't ignore any longer, but also be a force in going to governments and say, we need to pressure government into putting in the right types of regulations and the right types of infrastructure to allow these new business opportunities to go and bring societal benefits. So that's a very long history, starting with post-World War II.
Alan, you did it quite succinctly.
I think it shows that there's an underlying power to this movement, and people should not, or I would say, ignore it at your peril.
Alan, you did it quite succinctly, and I think that we're all counting on you for a paper soon on this topic and further discussion. We have a couple of questions that have come in now, and I think you're well suited for a couple of them, if you don't mind, while we have the remaining time.
Sure.
One of them from Sarah Clark, who's an amazing champion on climate issues in London, is about the role of climate activism as influencing investors. Can you speak to the role that you think those activists, the Greta Thunbergs of the world, have played in helping to educate an older generation of investors?
Yeah, I think there's two things. Point number one is, I always say this, I think that the people who are what we might call climate deniers, I think that's basically denial is a belief that there's no way to get out of it, and therefore you have to say it's not happening. I believe what's so important is to keep pounding on people as to how important it is, because we can come out of a pandemic and go back to work potentially. We can't come out of a climate disaster and go back to work. It's just not going to be possible. So the ones that are promoting that and pushing that and making people aware of it are playing a very important role. But one place that I think, Treasurer, I disagree with some of the movement now. The focus has to be on getting investments in things like direct air capture and battery technologies and methane reduction and other things that we know can now bring about a significant reduction in carbon. Actually saying that people should stop investing in carbon companies, until we scale those investments, we're just not going to stop producing carbon. It's just not going to happen. So making people aware of it is important, but getting behind the new technologies, to me, is the real catalyst to make this go.
Yeah, at IX we talk about capital being a unit of energy, and you can choose what to give energy to. And so many projects are out there that need capital and need energy, and these are the projects that are going to transition us from a dirty energy economy to a clean energy economy.
Absolutely.
And there are trillions of dollars that can be allocated in that way. and we're working with many of you on trying to raise that.
And I'll say one last thing, Treasurer. We discussed this in Scotland. So many of these technologies will be able to get billions and billions of dollars invested behind them once they are proven to work. But that's where the investment that goes into, you know, understanding which ones are likely to work and having capital that's willing to take the risk at a very nice return to show that those technologies work. Then there'll be a ton of capital to get them going. And then the other thing is to pressure government to have the regulatory environment that expedites the use of those new technologies.
Well, we couldn't agree more. We are right at the point where we wanted to be in terms of the schedule. I'd like to thank all of the speakers, thank our chair, Sarah Bloom Raskin, who kicked things off. Alan, special thanks to you for wrapping things up. Thanks to all of the IX partners and shareholders and friends that joined the call. This is going to be the first of many of these events. We had hoped to do it in person, but I think it worked pretty well on Zoom, and none of us had to get on an airplane to have the conversation. So look out for more conversations like this in the future. We have a separate but related initiative called Sustainable Future that Alan and others are involved with, Louis, James in particular. You'll be hearing more about that soon. But in the meantime, I hope everybody's families stay healthy, stay safe. We will be in touch with you soon, and thank you for joining us all today.